You're watching Inside Story on Al Jazeera America. I'm Ray Suarez. Both at the State of the Union address, when Democrats cheered and Republicans sat quiet when the president talked about how many more people had health insurance, or in the coming days and weeks as he hits the road to preach the virtues of a higher minimum wage and more government help paying for child care, Republicans, after big midterm victories and holding the gavel in the House and Senate, will be cast in the role of explaining why those things are bad ideas. Still with me as we turn from the policy to the politics of so-called middle-class economics are Harry Stein, Director for Fiscal Policy at the Center for American Progress. From Denver, Hadley Heath Manning, a policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, and Pete Sepp, President of the National Taxpayers Union. Hadley, has the president set a trap for the people on the other side of the aisle?
I don't believe so. I think Republicans could spend some time responding to some of the proposals that the president has made, but they would be better off, quite frankly, focusing on their own agenda for the future. Do a better job communicating exactly how many of their policy priorities, which they are very clear about, repealing and replacing Obamacare, reforming taxes, these changes, they need to make sure Americans understand explicitly how those changes would benefit the Americans that the president consistently addresses when he says middle class. People who are middle income, where are they going to see benefits from a Republican sort of policy agenda?
But last night we saw people sitting quietly, Hadley, as half the House cheered lustily for raising the minimum wage, for instance. Is Mitch McConnell going to sit with a bunch of people making $8.25 an hour and explain to them why it would be a bad idea for them to make by law $10.25 an hour?
No, I think instead the focus of Republicans should be on explaining how what our country truly needs is real wage growth that happens naturally because our economy is growing and adding jobs, not wage growth that comes from artificial wage increases through government mandate. Those kinds of wage increases don't really benefit the workers in that group because so many of them will either lose a job or face price inflation because of the impact of those policies. So at the end of the day, Republicans can paint, I believe, a brighter future for workers at every income level if they focus on a policy of economic growth rather than on simply responding to the political talking points about minimum wage.
Pete Sepp, it sounds like a tall order explaining to a low-wage worker why it would be better for them to get one kind of raise as opposed to another. It may be totally true, but politics is different from policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if Republicans are smart, they'll give their messages a bit of attenuation depending on who they're talking to. One way to appeal to middle-class investors, for example, is to propose a very policy. From now on, you can take inflation into account when you're calculating your capital gains, so you're no longer paying taxes on phantom gains. That would be an easily sellable proposal, I think, to somebody who's, say, 60 years old. They've held a mutual fund or something for 20, 30 years. Why should they have to pay taxes on inflationary gains? That's as easy to explain as the stepped-up basis proposal the president has. I think it would have some appeal.
Does the president sort of neutralize some of the gaps that now exist between Democrats and Republicans in the Congress, Harry?
Well, I hope so. You know, I think at a minimum, the victory of middle-class economics is that at least we're all talking about the right problem. We're all talking now about this problem of how do we grow wages for everybody. You know, we do have economic growth. We are creating jobs, but wages remain stagnant and costs are going up. At least we're talking about the right problem. And the good news is, at least in some cases, we've heard at least a sense that there might even be some overlap on solutions. Expanding the earned income tax credit is something that Paul Ryan's talked about, Barack Obama's talked about. That's great. Now, my hope is that that's a sincere proposal from Congressman Ryan. I think that ideally what you would do is you would both raise the minimum wage and increase the earned income tax credit. And instead, frankly, what I think you sometimes see from advocates of an expanded EITC is we really only tend to hear it from them when they're explaining to us why we shouldn't raise the minimum wage so that people can at least get something approaching a living wage.
Very quickly, Harry, before we go, has the president created a template for the national conversation for 2016 for both parties?
Oh, I think he absolutely has. You know, I do think it's going to be important for for both sides, for Republicans to respond to the policies that he's laid out, to lay out their own agenda for raising wages for everybody. And if they're going to break from this old trickle-down ideology, it's going to be incumbent on them to explain new policies to do that.
Harry Stein, Pete Sepp, Hadley Heath Manning, great to have you. That brings us to the end of this edition of Inside Story. Thanks for being with us. The program's over, but the conversation continues. We want to hear what you think about the issues raised on this day's show. Log on to our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter. We'll see you next time in Washington. I'm Ray Suarez.